CentreCourt MBA Festival. It's the last in a series of events that we've been holding all across North America, and a very happy return to the Times Center for what promises to be quite an amazing day. For those of you with real grit and stamina, you might still be here at 5:30 to take in a masterclass case study from one of the star professors from the Harvard Business School, and then really just the chance to meet admissions representatives from 34 of the world's top business schools. So we're thrilled that they're here with us, and we're thrilled to have all of you with us to kick off with the committee. We always start with the committee. This is being live streamed to a global audience, and the idea that people like you, and in fact some of you, because you've been submitting profiles to sort of assess your chances, the strengths, weaknesses of your profiles, and the idea, of course, is to put it to the inside experts. And I'm joined on the panel. I have Lee Gauthier, who is the Assistant Director of MBA Admissions at the University of Toronto, Rotman. Lee, great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
On this time zone, because you're constantly traveling with the school. Francisco Chabran, actually based here in New York. You are the Director of International Development for the IE Business School out of Madrid. And then to complete our geographic roundup,
yes.
Diana Economy, who is the Admissions Director at Michigan Ross.
That's right.
So thanks all three of you. And as you know, we've prepared some of the slides. And the idea is to take you through the sort of profiles, the challenges, the strengths, the weaknesses. Kirti had written into us. Kirti is currently working in corporate finance with an Indian group, Airtel, and was previously at one of the large banks in India, the ICICI, and has some of the top schools in her targets, but wants to make a career switch to strategy consulting, which of course, nothing quite like the MBA to help that sort of transition. She brings with her a background in pharmacy from Osmania in India, and the data points. Well, actually, let's start with data points, because GPA, we're always talking about a 4.0 scale. Diana, you're seeing so many applications from all over the world.
That's right, yeah.
Do we actually need to make the switch and tell you what we think that GPA from Brazil or from India or China might equate to on a US system?
Right, so while we have just the number here, one of the things that we do as an admissions team is, of course, we're taking a look at the full transcript. We're taking a look at the body of coursework taken. We're taking a look at how well they did. And we also recognize that there's different standards at different universities, right? A 76.7 at one school could be very different at another. And given the volume of applications that we see, we have a good sense for the competitiveness based on the academic profile. But I would say that, coupled with the GMAT as well as the work experience, are the things we're taking a look at to know if the candidate's likely to be academically successful in the program.
Right. Now, the committee, many of the profiles, we've had that Indian engineer, typically Indian male engineers from the IITs. In Kirti's case, the fact that she did pharmacy is a little different. And then outside of school and outside of her work, she's been very engaged with a women's support group at work, and then outside of work. So, Francisco, as we look at not just that professional track that they're following, but everything else that you would love them to share, what they're doing inside work and outside work. So how important is that?
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things that jumped out the most to me about this profile, especially given the desire for the kind of career pivot. This is the typical kind of profile to me that jumps out, like tell me a story. So I think that is really important for a candidate like this, that really to help us put some context around where they are right now in their professional and personal life. And so that kind of telling that story gives the opportunity to incorporate those different pieces of what they have going on besides their academic and professional history, and really tell a story, So this is the type of application that I normally see, where I see a lot of different really nice things, but I want to understand better how they fit together as an entire package of the candidate. So I think that those those additional pieces outside the academic and professional experience are kind of good ways to bookend that story and help give me a better understanding of who that person is.
Right. Lee, of course, coming out of Rotman, any number of new career opportunities that open up. Kirti's 8 years out of school, so let's imagining that she's approaching 30, may have even reached that milestone. And she's talking about strategy consulting, so the MBB, the McKinseys, Bains, and BCGs. Is there a point and perhaps an age when that transition You know, if she was talking about getting into a McKinsey at the age of 33 or 34 coming out of school, that's typically not their recruiting sweet spot, right?
That is correct. And I mean, we know never to say never. We've all heard stories of students who have done things that look, you know, impossible to do. So I wouldn't say no. However, that's a very good point. And I think something that candidates need to think about is the realistic portion of their career choice post-MBA. And what does that say to admissions about you and how you're thinking? And then also, what is your, you know, game plan if that were not to transpire? So if you do look at her age, and again, we're guessing, and it's not really about age, it's about work experience, it's almost double some of the averages of our schools. So I do think that she would be an outlier both for schools and for the MBBs.
Right, and perhaps Diana, just a point on the GMAT is one data point in a much bigger process, but beyond sort of 800 scores, you're then sort of diving into the detail and might pick out that verbal or perhaps particularly the quant score. What are you then looking for to sort of reassure you as an admissions committee?
Yeah, so I mean, ultimately, we're responsible to the faculty for bringing in a class that's academically prepared and ready for the, you know, the rigors of the curriculum. You know, to give some context, you know, just here in Ann Arbor 4 weeks ago was our students started, and I'm sure fairly similar on campuses across the country, our students are taking microeconomics and strategy and accounting and, you know, statistics in a very intense fashion very quickly, right? And so if we were to say who's academically prepared and how do we take a look at some of those things that are going to give us those indicators, you know, yes, of course, we want to make sure that candidates are balanced. But again, I think it goes back to, you know, she's got a pharmacy major, so that maybe has some science and quantitative implications perhaps to it. A 730, certainly well balanced with both verbal and quant, so that's those are good to see, and her professional path even would lead me to believe that she has to have a lot of relationships with different individuals throughout her professional career. So I think she can translate both the quantitative as well as some of the interpersonal skills that I think would help her in the classroom.
Right, so interesting academic background, strong sort of career track, well-balanced scores, you know, Francesco, your point. So strong candidate, but maybe, you know, really wanting to use this opportunity to apply to business schools to think deeply about those post-MBA career goals so that that overall narrative really makes sense and reassures you as a committee. Great. Well, Kirti, thanks for getting us started. I actually got the chance to speak to the next applicant who sort of said, you know, in initial discussions, people said, hey, you know, you did art history at Skidmore, you're working now at the MoMA, you know, where does business school fit into your trajectory? But that's the beauty, right? The idea of, you know, the bankers, the consultants, the software engineers, and then someone that comes up with this. And Emma was explaining that on top of her background, she's actually followed a certificate in software engineering here at Columbia in the city, and imagines bringing the art world into the 21st century. So, you know, Francisco, lots of non-traditional applicants to the schools. Does that excite you?
Yeah, this is a profile that actually, I've seen a very similar profile to myself, actually, who just joined our intake of our international MBA program in just now in September. And so this is definitely a profile that we get excited about at IE, because I think something that's super important for us is that when we talk about diversity at our school, we're not just talking about diversity in terms of where people come from, but also diversity in terms of the professional industries that those folks come from, because we feel that people with a non-traditional MBA career path bring a different perspective to the classroom, and we think that everybody benefits from that. So I think that a profile like this one is one that I get really excited about, but also have a lot of managing expectations that I want to do, and having a good understanding that this person knows our program well, and they're choosing it for the right reasons. Because sometimes, I think on the flip side of it, we get excited by a profile like this. We also want to ensure that we are able to, you know, line up with what they're expecting in terms of the programs and what they're hoping to get out of it in terms of their career after they graduate.
Diana's point about the transcripts, Lee, as you dive into an art history transcript, there may not be a lot of quant courses in there. So as you think about, you know, she certainly has, you know, a strong academic background and that rigor. What else would you then be looking for, you know, excited by this less traditional profile? I mean, do you end up being, it's an admissions director, not a rejection director. So are you then looking for the reasons to admit this person rather than the reasons to push them away?
I think that's a great perspective because I think, again, we are looking for, talent coming from around the world, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. And so when you talk about class diversity, as was just mentioned, we're looking for a real holistic candidate, and we don't want just the typical. In fact, I think you can't even use the word non-traditional anymore because everything is now, up for grabs in terms of either entering an MBA or exiting an MBA. So I think a profile like this is super spiky. That said, you do have to look at the GRE and the verbal and the quant scores. Again, certainly admissible. I would probe a little bit in terms of her preparation on some of the quant side if she's not been exposed to that. Certainly her experience in the Columbia course or certificate may have helped a little bit on that side in terms of sharpening the left side of her brain. So I don't think it's a concern, but there might be a conversation for sure.
Right, so in the conversations you're having in admissions, you're thinking about both the left side and the right side of a candidate's brain. That's good for all of us, I think, to be aware of. Diana, just bringing us to recommenders. Now, she was talking about the M7 schools and probably needs to do some work reaching out to the schools, refining those goals, alignment, how that would fit with where she wants to go next. You'd assume there's an upside of asking a recommender who's applied successfully to business school. They know this whole process. Is there a downside when the Harvard alum from 20 years ago is still talking about heroic individualism?
Right.
And at schools like Ross and Kellogg and Stanford, Haas, there's a far more collaborative culture. So can asking the wrong recommender with their legacy of business school experience actually undermine the application?
That's right. I mean, the best recommender, hands down, is somebody who knows your work well, right? Because the recommendation is giving us context as to who this candidate's going to be when they come into our community, who they are professionally, right? What are their accomplishments, what that looks like. And I think candidates think, gosh, I should find a recommender that's sort of at a target school or that maybe has an in that's going to help me out. But the reality is, if they don't know you and they don't know your work well, the recommendation's likely to fall flat, right? And it's going to sort of give generalizations versus specifics as to how that candidate's been accomplished and what they've done. I'd much prefer somebody who knows your work well to an alum.
Right. Now, in Emma's case, she's looking for school, not next year, but the year after that. So Francisco, in terms of finding that other recommender, she's currently got her boss at the MoMA who could write one of those letters, looking for another one. Would you actually think to step outside of the work environment, if there was something substantive that she has done, would be an interesting additional voice?
100%, yeah. So I mean, looking outside of a professional role for a recommendation, especially if it's in some other strong extracurricular part of this candidate's life, I think that could be super interesting. But I think that going back to the point of relevancy it's a really kind of fine line there because of course you want to find somebody who knows you well, but also understands specifically what you're trying to do and how you're qualified to do it. And obviously we're speaking about an MBA here, so you want to make sure that somebody who's somewhat familiar with that process and what that really entails, because it's a delicate situation in that picking the wrong person outside of a professional or an academic context, you could also miss the mark. So I think it's delicate, but definitely something that I would encourage somebody to do.
Right, and she's got this ArtX Tech panel, which I think she's organizing in November. That might be the source of, again, that substantive sort of relationship. So great profile. You're looking for those additional points that really sort of consolidate, make sure that she can handle discounted cash flow and everything else that you're going to hit her with. But Emma, don't feel that you're non-traditional and there's not a place for you at business school. You can see the smiles on our panelists' faces. Max, of course, New York profile. We've got the hedge funds. I hope that he made it in from Connecticut to join us, and some of the financial powerhouses on his list, including London Business School in Europe. So he's with a hedge fund. Now, is this an example, Lee? Does this matter in terms of when candidates talk about jobs in hedge funds, venture capital, private equity, unless you have some sort of background that would, those are very difficult doors to open, even with the wonderful schools and the opportunities that you all provide. So would it be reassuring to you that he already had a foot in the hedge fund industry, as he then described, those next steps coming out of school?
Absolutely. Again, back to our earlier candidate, I mean, we always see students and prospective students and alumni who do amazing things that may not have looked possible, but they're often the exception to the rule. And so if you are going to be heading into something like a hedge fund or PE, definitely you're not going to use that MBA as a rule to transition right into that. That might be a step, B or C after you've graduated and got your first role and got your finance under your belt. So yeah, I think for this particular candidate, because they do have that background, that's going to be hugely valued by the school and by the potential employers at the other end.
Right. And then outside of professional, Diana, he talks about a leg to stand on and mentoring for Penn students. Now, we often see Minds Matter, Big Brother, Big Sister, there are many of these different volunteer organizations, and it's not that you prefer one over the other, but it's not just that line in the resume that says volunteer at. You're really looking for more substance than that.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, we want people who are passionate about, about things and who really care, are committed, because we're not just admitting you into an MBA program, we're admitting you into a community, right? And what are the things that make you tick? What are the things that you're passionate about? And there's a lot of variation amongst extracurriculars, which is to say some of it's very passive. It's something that you do every once in a while. And some of it are things that people just say, this is really what I'm driven by, and I'm really investing a lot of time in that. It's a fine line. I'll tell you that at Ross, we actually got rid of the section asking people about extracurriculars because people were putting a laundry list of things and it wasn't clear what they were actually passionate about. So we are advising candidates to put it on their resume if it's something that really stands out as that they want us to know about. And I would even say, just as you're thinking about your resume being, sort of context, action, result, and demonstrating your results, if you have something that you're particularly passionate about, what is it about that experience? Is there a contribution that you've made as a result of that extracurricular that might help to demonstrate to us, what that commitment looks like and what that level is? Because, of course, we love to see all of these things, but there's a lot of variation in the extent to which people are engaged in them. And if you're really engaged, let us know, but demonstrate that maybe through the resume or in the interview.
Right, so sometimes less is more,
right,
and to actually spend more time on those things where there's a true commitment and a passion.
That's right.
Rather than trying to fill that list of... At Rotman, you will look beyond the GMAT. Now, Max hasn't taken his GMAT, but with a 3.3 GPA and some of the schools that he's applying to with averages closer to 3.75 out on the West Coast, he's going to have to nail a great GMAT score. There are other places at Rotman that you will look beyond the GMAT. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if any of you, either in the audience today or online, have undertaken the CFA Level 3, we absolutely understand what it takes to get that, whether you're a chart holder or not. And so as a result, what we do as a school, we admit students without a GMAT who have written the CFA Level 3, because I think, as tough as the GMAT may be for some folks, the CFA Level 3 is, way above that. So I think schools definitely have different ways of looking at intellectual horsepower, GMAT being one of them, GPA being another, but even work experience can also determine or suggest how a person thinks based on what they're doing on a day-to-day basis and how that rigorous thinking might show up in an academic setting.
Right. If Max takes a practice test on the GMAT, comes up with a 640 or 650, and he's going to need to take some time. The hedge fund, no doubt, keeps him very busy during the week. He's looking at this year or next year, applying to school. I mean, the advice, of course, is you put together that sparkling application as strong as it can be. And if he finds that it's a struggle to come away with that competitive score, he might do well to wait a year, right? Let's see, he's out of school in 2015, so he's still in his early mid-20s and maybe taking the time. Now, I think the next one, let's see, we have Sarah. Digital marketing, and again, looking at the top schools, and perhaps the CentreCourt is, of course, the chance to really connect with schools, find out about what each of you have to offer. She's been working at Nielsen for the last 4 years. If you've been at a company for a long time, there's perhaps this temptation just to put your latest job title. Mm-hmm. But do you actually like to see the steps that they've taken as they've moved through that company? Diana, can you speak to that?
Absolutely. We're looking for that progression. We're looking to see how you've challenged yourself. We're looking to see what opportunities that you've taken on that may be differentiated from other people that have gone through a similar path, right? So we do want to see that progression. Now, listen, not every company allows for that kind of title advancement, right? And so we have people that'll come and they'll say, gosh, I've been doing this role for 3 years, and of course I have the same title, but there's no way that year 1 looks like year 3. And so you're going to want to make sure, of course, in the bullet points that that's really well articulated to us, spending more time on the more like senior level things that you've been working on recently that'll help us get an understanding of where where your professional path has led you.
Right. As Sarah's sort of starting out on this path and trying to get to know the schools, Of course, coming to see all of you in Toronto and in Madrid and in Ann Arbor is going to be a wonderful opportunity for them to understand the DNA of the institution, meet students and staff. What are some of the other alternatives if that's not an option open to her? I mean, Francisco, you'll actually fly them out to Madrid it's that important to you to get them to see the school.
Yeah, so I think something that's super important, of course, like you mentioned, if you have the opportunity to visit campus, that's ideal, particularly when there is some sort of open day or type of recruiting admissions type of event. And there will be occasions where we find extremely highly qualified candidates that we really think they should have that opportunity, and we will take the measures to go ahead and send them out to Spain so that they can experience our culture firsthand. That being said, we know that that's not realistically possible for everyone, given professional commitments, family commitments, lots of different things. So in that case, I would really encourage folks to get to know the local alumni community of their school. Here, for example, in New York City, IE has one of our largest alumni clubs in North America, and they're very happy. They host a series of activities, every month. One professional, one social, and it's always funny when I of course as an alumni show up at these activities, and there I find my candidate that I've been working with, and I'm, how did you get here? Oh, well, I reached out to so and so on LinkedIn, who I knew was an alumni, and they invited me to come down and join today. So obviously, for me, somebody who's helping that person through the admissions process, having that person end up at one of my local alumni club's events without me inviting them, I think really shows a tremendous amount of initiative and their really true desire to understand the community of people that they'll be a part of going forward if they do kind of go down this road. So I think local alumni groups as much as possible, and I think that all of our schools, given the international nature of our student body, have those in many places where our students will find themselves.
Right. This tendency to sort of put schools in buckets. I don't know if you do that with the candidates themselves, but this is a finance school, this is a marketing school, this is good for tech. For someone like Sarah, who's worked within a media company like Nielsen, and perhaps looking to broaden that role, if they then identify something about Rotman, about any of your schools, and really say, the intrinsic appeal was, what you do in design thinking, what you do in this area. Now, that's something that will probably resonate with you as an admissions committee, right, Lee?
Yeah, for sure. I think we need to see that you've done your research, particularly by the time of the application. Everybody starts from ground zero, but when you get to the application part, if you can demonstrate fit, you use the word culture, I think that's really relevant, especially if, it's something that maybe we wouldn't see pop from a particular application. You sometimes have to connect the dot for us. And if you can do that by ways of, looking at our curricula or something that our professors are doing, or, even one of our groups that is outstanding, I think those ways show that you've really done your homework and you see yourself in our school.
Right. Sometimes, given long work hours in so many industries, it's difficult to find that extracurricular opportunity. But there are opportunities within work. I noticed that her committee member role is for Hispanic talent, but within Nielsen. For you, Diana, that has the same validity, whether it was an external organization or something that they had identified in a role they played in work.
Right. There are some companies, Deloitte, for example, and others where that's really required, right? As part of your engagement as a consultant there, that they are expecting that you're engaging in these ways. And of course, there are a lot of other places where you sort of have to seek that out a little bit more so. So it is absolutely okay if some of that engagement is part of your current work experience. It's also okay if it's been part of the longevity of your professional path. It might have been something that you were passionate about that you're looking to pick back up again, that you haven't had the time. Frankly, I think that's what the MBA is in part for, right, is to explore those passions and have an opportunity to further your understanding of what that could mean for your professional career.
Right. Great. So, Sarah, do the research, really connect with the schools. That's something that I think is going to shine through and help you, connect with all of them. 20% of GDP in this country is spent on healthcare. Not everybody perhaps understands just how many opportunities are emerging in that field. Ross is among a list that Carl has identified. He spent the last 2 years at Bulletin Healthcare. He also, earlier in his career, had a role as editor-in-chief of Next magazine, which perhaps was a very different sort of experience. Francisco, as you look at that career narrative, you're trying to join the dots and say, they started off maybe in publishing, now here they are, working in healthcare, but there's a thread, marketing, communication. How do you try to sort of work your way through professional experience to understand that narrative?
So I think what's really important, I mean, I think usually in a candidate like this is something that we would probably look to try to have them walk us through during during the interview stage of an application. So if this person were to be passed an interview, I think that would be their opportunity to really kind of, thread that needle for us. I think so. If I was to have some feedback for Carl, no, I would say, okay, that you're probably a little bit unsure, and so we might have our questions as well. So I think for Carl particularly, the interview is going to be a very important part of the interview, and I think that the way that Carl's going to be able to do that is obviously explain the connection between all of the roles, which we can loosely see. But I think even better way of explaining that would be what they want to do with the MBA, right? So the post-MBA career goals are super important in this particular case in telling that story. Strategy consultant in healthcare, I would want to understand a little bit more how they plan to leverage their past professional experience and the commonalities they see amongst it, and how they think that MBA is going to help them. And then give me more about the strategy consultant healthcare piece, because I'm seeing some gaps there that I'm going to need that candidate to help me fill in.
Got it. So Lee, as Carl sits down with recommenders, at Bulletin Healthcare, and so that background that he has in the sort of the HCM industry, maybe a word of advice of saying, let's really reinforce the healthcare credentials that I have that will give more substance to where I see myself coming out of the MBA. How do you sort of recommend that we connect with recommenders?
Yeah, I'll be honest, when I first started in admissions and I came from the career side, I wasn't really sure how much value I would get out of reading the recommenders. Knowing that when you apply for a job and you use a reference, of course they're going to say great things about you because you would not do that otherwise, right? You would not suggest them. So I was thinking, what is the value going to be in a referee? Because we know you chose them, we know they're going to say that you're great. However, having read literally thousands of recommenders for over the years, I think that they have a very unique position in your application in that they can verify, they can share even greater details. Some people are quite humble, and you read the resume and you look at all the stats and you think they're good, and then you read the recommendations of someone who's in the know of what they actually did, and you go, wow, why didn't you say that about yourself, right? So I think the recommenders do have a huge impact on admissions, and I think to think about, okay, not just, in this case we've got the president, well that's great. However, does the president actually really know on a day-to-day basis what you are doing? And do they have the time and energy, presuming that they're filling out more than one reference, to actually sit down and do a thoughtful, thorough reference for you? So I would say don't always go for the top of the house. Make sure that you sit down with your referee and explain what school you're going to and why, and what your career path is. And then have an understanding, do they feel that they can really lend credibility to your application? And those are the things I'd say that would be helpful for a candidate.
Right. Carl spent 4 years in Ann Arbor at U of M.
That's right. Go
so
blue.
Go blue. And probably comes back every other weekend for the game. Does that help? Does that show he thrived in that academic environment for 4 years?
Right.
Is that something that you like to see at Ross?
Well, I'll give you some context. I'm a two-time Wolverine, undergrad and MBA from Ross, right? So I'm a fan. No, that does not give you a leg up, though, certainly. I think we talked a little bit earlier about culture and fit and understanding schools, and I think students come into the process with a lot of ideas around what a school's like and what their placement's like and where they can go geographically after and what the opportunities are. And you referenced earlier schools sort of, people sort of bucket like, oh, this is for finance or this is for marketing. But for some of our programs, like, Ross is strong sort of across the board, and it's one of the things where people maybe don't know, what to say, like, okay, which is it for this or this? And it's really sort of a well-rounded program for a lot of different things. And so I think as students are getting to know programs, we talked a little bit about coming to visit or going to the alumni events. We have student ambassadors online. You can go to campuses on your interview day. There's a lot of ways to get to know the program, both in person as well as remotely. There's more webinar options. There's various things. One thing I would caution Carl is just because he knows Michigan, it's sort of knowing Ross as well, right? So within that context.
Right. So Carl making sure that that healthcare credential really comes through. Justin is on a different track, and I guess Francisco, with just before CentreCourt, we wrote a piece about the growing number of US applicants that are looking at the European business schools. You've seen a real uptick in those numbers. Again, interesting background. He was at a vineyard in the Catskills for a couple of years, and before that, the South African winery. Now, typically, I think you have, 120 nationalities in IE Business School.
That's correct.
So here's one more. How does he need that international experience? How do you evaluate if someone has the sort of the global mindset for the culture of a school like IE, INSEAD, or HEC?
I think what's super important for us in that context is understanding people's ability to work with folks from other cultures. So we know that some people do have the opportunity to have international exposure in their professional career, and obviously that's something that we definitely see as an attribute. There's no way around that. But at the same time, here in the United States, maybe we have a candidate who necessarily has an extremely, maybe on paper, domestic experience. That doesn't necessarily mean that their professional experience has not been international. So maybe they work for a large consulting firm or a multinational corporation or a finance organization, and they're working on projects that have colleagues, in London, in Mumbai, and so I would really encourage a candidate maybe who hasn't worked in various different international locations, but does have that international work experience within inside of the project or the companies that they've worked on, to really highlight that. And then, of course, I think the places in which you've worked as well. Obviously, somebody, I'd say somebody who has a lot of professional here in New York. It's a fairly international experience in and of itself. So, and also the type of companies they worked at, I think it speaks a lot to it. So, not necessarily, it's not mandatory that somebody's necessarily had work experience outside their country where they were born or where they reside. But I think there are a lot of other ways to get that international professional experience. And I feel like a lot of times students who are very shy and feel a little bit too domestic, they don't do a good enough job translating those domestic international experiences on their applications.
So really think about it and bring those things to the surface in a very cosmopolitan city like New York. Toronto is similarly cosmopolitan. Now in Justin's sort of extracurriculars, we've got skydiving, photography, also AKA cooking. What else do you guys see a lot? Running,
reading.
So is it, so I made this great meal for a group of friends, or, we had Syrian migrants that have been moving into Toronto, and so we organized a meal for them. Beyond those sort of cooking, reading, and running, where can they take those sort of passions to really help you as an admissions office?
Well, first thing I think I'd say is make sure it's a demonstrated passion. Because if it's on your resume or in your application, it's fair game. And so if you think that it's hot right now to be passionate about X and you throw it on your resume, you're going to lose if you can't have a back up to what you've done to demonstrate that passion. So I think that would be the number one thing. And then, beyond those bullets, we're looking for impact. We're looking for what does this passion give you? Does it demonstrate to us, and quite frankly, a future employer, a characteristic or an attribute that is going to be valuable in the MBA and in the marketplace? So for example, let's take something like sports. You've got some sort of, marathon, triathlete, et cetera. I mean, you wouldn't just write that on your resume, but looking at that and knowing what it takes to prepare for one of those events tells us a little bit about who you are, what your resilience is, what is your ability to push through tough times, pushing the limits, etc. So we're always looking underneath those bullets for something about you that maybe doesn't show up in your work experience. So I would say think thoughtfully and carefully, make sure that it's evidence-based, and realize that we're actually using that to infer something about you and hopefully something great about you.
Right. Great. And Diana, if I could just get you to comment on approaching a college professor for a recommendation. I mean, the sort of questions that you're asking are maybe more looking at your professional background.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, at Michigan Ross, we only have one recommendation letter. I know a lot that have two, and so we're certainly not looking for a professor in the one. We're looking more for a direct report manager, right? But I think even in schools that have two, we have a backing of what your academic track record has been, right? So we've got your transcript. We understand who you are, and so so I think a college professor in most cases isn't going to give us the professional context that a recommendation letter otherwise would of who are you going to be when you start talking to internship employers, looking at full-time MBA, post-MBA outcomes. What does that look like? And I'm not sure that the professor is the best choice in those cases.
Right, okay. We get a lot of tech backgrounds, an increasing number, the software engineers. In fact, no, forgive me, I'm going to, all right, Jessica, I'm jumping ahead to Sean. Let's see, Jessica's a couple of years out from applying to school. She's got 18 months with Capital One. So perhaps just sort of big picture on this one. Francesca, how can she use the next couple of years? It's great that she's already thinking about business school. How can she best use that time to sort of put in place her personal and professional growth and connecting with the schools?
So I think that the big piece that stands out for me here in terms of that are the two words I see, fintech or VC. That really for me raises a lot of flags because it's like, what does that mean, right? So I think that something that Jessica could use the next couple of years to do is to really get a better, firmer understanding of what those industries look like and specific type of organizations and roles that she would find particularly interesting and get to know them better. I mean, obviously having some experience would be the ideal thing, but if the idea is that, that things are obviously going, very well at Capital One and, Jessica wants to continue that experience, I would really encourage Jessica to jump into the areas of fintech and VC that particularly interest her and try to understand where people in those industries who have done MBAs, where did they do them? Right. And so that's a really good understanding because I think fintech maybe not so much so, but definitely in the world of venture capital, as you suggested before, networks are going to be a very, very big thing, and some of them might be very geographic in nature and sector in nature. So I would definitely encourage Jessica to use this time to really get a good understanding of these industries and the people who have done MBAs with them, where they did them at.
Right.
I mean, and the fact that she's at Capital One already, I mean, I think one of the things that candidates, especially if they're a year or two out, right? Capital One is clearly thinking about fintech, right? They're very invested in that. That's something that they're looking to move forward. And so she may not have to leave her organization to be able to have some exposure to the types of things that she's looking for. So if you've got time before you're applying, part of it is thinking about how am I leveraging the current experiences and opportunities that are right around me to develop an understanding or a skill set that's going to help propel me into the career that I'm looking for too. So
right, and if I can just draw you to two words in the extracurriculars, accomplished cellist. Sometimes people are apologetic for wonderful talents that they have in a creative artistic field and think, well, business school doesn't care about that. You do, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think Dan Pink said, MFA is the new MBA. And of course it's not, but those who do have that nice interplay between, the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain are really what we would call spiky candidates. Because they are able to bring a whole different perspective. And often, like I was saying with regard to sports, it also applies in art. So if you do have something that's outstanding in one of those areas, you want to share that. Accomplished, don't really understand what that means, so we'd have to ask about it. But if you have a certain grade level, or you can share where you've played, again, people tend to downplay those, and they really actually are very, very spiky and a very strong indicator of who that is as a person.
Right. Now, Sean, rather than the sort of the tech background, he's more on the salesman side, but I don't want us to talk about Sean, because Sean will be able to come and see you at 3 o'clock and share his background and experience. We couldn't do a New York event without talking about Donnie. Oh. Donnie is working in real estate, targeting some of the top schools. In fact, he's been in his family's business in real estate for the past few years, but sees using business school as a switch of career. Perhaps public service will come later in his life, but immediately out of school, he wants to go into media, maybe sees himself hosting a sort of reality TV show or something, leisure, casinos, whatever, lots of opportunities open. He transferred out of Fordham after 2 years and completed his undergrad at Wharton. GMAT, he hasn't taken it, but he does claim to have a very high IQ. He hosts the Miss Universe beauty pageant and has published on deal making. Got some interesting choices of recommenders, family member, and then an influential politician on the other side of the world. What do you think about Donnie? Would he find a place in the world's top business schools, or should he be looking for a career move down to Washington?
Where do we start with Donnie? I mean, Wow, so many different things here.
Well, I think it's fair to say that every candidate who applies gets a fair and holistic assessment. I mean, the bottom line is we would absolutely look at this profile. However, you need to look at, what impression you're leaving the committee with. And I think there are some things on here that are not necessarily part of a great story that he may want to tell, or a brand or an impression that he may want to leave with us. And so, fine, these are your choices, your decisions. We're not there to judge that necessarily. However, you could be raising some red flags with your choices. And I think that you should proceed with caution. If there's something that someone could perceive as a red flag on your resume, your application, whatever, think long and hard about that.
Francisco.
So shameless plug for international MBA programs here. I think that Donnie could definitely benefit from maybe applying for some schools outside the US. That could probably be an experience that would be super useful for Donnie. I mean, I think obviously we're in the business of that, but I think that that's one thing that jumped out at me just automatically.
Right, bring down the walls and build those sort of cultural bridges.
I think it could be a great experience for Donnie to spend some time outside of the United States getting an MBA.
Sounds like a good plan.
Yeah.
And I think the father's probably not a good recommender.
Family recommenders, just a quick word on that one.
Not so much, yes. So even if you're in part of a family business and you're working very closely with your family, a great recommender might be a client or somebody who's, from an objective third-party perspective, can shed some light on your professional path.
I think also just piggybacking on top of that, I think that recommendations from political folks are always tricky as well, unless you've explicitly worked in politics. It's great if you have we met some wonderful candidates down in DC on Thursday who are working, on the Senate Foreign Intelligence Committee. In that case, a political reference is more than appropriate. Right. But there's been a number of times where we've gotten letters of recommendations from the president of such and such Latin American country, and it's very obvious that that person doesn't know this student. So I think the political recommender is always something that you have to be careful about as well.
So choose the friend of the family ambassador well. Diane's so committed to her position at Ross that backstage after Paul Simon's farewell tour last night at Madison, she went to talk to him about career transition and what he might want to do next. Yeah. There's room for everybody in business.
If Paul Simon wants to come back, we're going to find a spot for him.
Well, we hope that you found this really helpful. You've all got unique and individual stories to share. And from 3 o'clock, you'll be able to meet with Lee, with Francisco, and with Diane to talk about your backgrounds and about fit with their business schools. Next up, we have an admissions director panel with Columbia, Chicago Booth, Emory Goizeta, and UC Berkeley Haas, followed by a dean's panel with MIT Sloan, Darden, and the Rochester School. So I think thank you to this wonderful panel for all of the insights that you've shared.
Thanks
very much.